Amid a raging storm, Michael, a determined farmer, is confronted by a harrowing sight: a frail, injured horse, barely clinging to life, trapped in a muddy quagmire. The flickering glow of his lamp reveals raw wounds and eyes filled with unbearable pain, echoing a long tale of neglect and abuse. Moved by compassion and unwavering resolve, Michael rushes to rescue this desperate creature, determined to bring it home for healing and care. But could this brave act set in motion a series of unexpected events that will forever alter the fate of the horse, and perhaps even Michael's own life? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. The night split open with a crash. Michael bolted upright, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. The sound had come from outside, sharp, desperate, a rattling thud like something had slammed into the gate. He froze for a second, ears straining over the storm's howl. Another noise followed, a weak, choking whimper, like an animal struggling against the inevitable. Grabbing the lamp with trembling hands, Michael yanked on his raincoat and shoved open the door. The wind hit him hard, slamming it shut behind him. Rain sheeted down, soaking through his boots within seconds as he made his way toward the gate. The lamp's glow barely pierced the darkness, but there it was, a shape, crumpled and pitiful, barely moving, a horse. Its ribs pressed sharply against its skin, and its legs sprawled unnaturally, the back one swollen grotesquely. Mud clung to its fur in thick clumps, blood trickling down its flank in jagged streaks. The animal's head jerked feebly at Michael's approach, its glazed eyes wild with panic. Michael gasped, nearly dropping the lamp. "Oh, Lord," he murmured, stepping closer. The horse flinched, trying to drag itself away, but its body betrayed it, collapsing under the effort. "It's okay," Michael said, his voice low and steady. He set the lamp on the ground, raising his hands slowly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The horse's chest heaved with labored breaths. Its ears flicked toward him, then back, uncertain. The closer Michael got, the more he could see the raw agony in its movements. This wasn't a simple injury. It was weeks, maybe months, of suffering carved into its body. Deep scars crisscrossed its legs and sides, some long-healed, others fresh and angry. Its mane was magically matted with dirt and sweat, and its hooves were cracked and caked with grime. Michael swallowed hard, anger rising in his chest. Who could do this? Who would let a creature fall into such misery? He knelt beside it, holding out a hand. "I know you're scared, but you're safe now." The horse didn't move, its strength nearly spent. Michael hesitated, then reached out to touch its mane. The animal stiffened, but didn't pull away, too weak to resist. "You poor thing," he whispered. "What have they done to you?" A flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and for a brief moment, Michael saw the horse's eyes clearly. They weren't just full of pain. They held a brokenness, a hollow kind of fear that came from betrayal. It hit him like a punch to the gut. He couldn't leave it here. He stood quickly, splashing through the mud back to the house. Inside, he grabbed a thick blanket and a coil of rope. The storm seemed to howl louder as he returned, the cold biting at his fingers as he draped the blanket over the horse's trembling body. "This'll help keep you warm," he murmured, securing it gently with the rope. "All right, buddy, we gotta get you inside," he said, gripping the rope and tugging carefully. The horse groaned, but didn't resist, its legs dragging uselessly through the mud. Every inch was a struggle, Michael's boots slipping as he pulled with all his strength. The rain lashed at his back, soaking him to the bone, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. Almost there, he panted, his breath clouding in the cold. The barn loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the storm. With one final heave, Michael got the horse inside, slamming the door shut against the wind. The barn was warmer, though not by much. Michael guided the horse onto a bed of straw, untying the blanket and checking its wounds again. The swollen leg worried him most. It looked like an old fracture, never set properly, now inflamed and oozing. He winced at the sight. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he muttered. The horse lay still, its chest rising and falling shallowly. Michael grabbed a bucket of water and a cloth, carefully wiping away the blood and mud. The horse flinched at first, but gradually relaxed under his touch. "That's it," Michael said softly. "Easy now." He worked tirelessly, cleaning its wounds and massaging its sore muscles. Time blurred as the storm raged outside. By the time he finished, his hands were numb and exhaustion tugged at him. But the horse's breathing had steadied, its body no longer trembling as violently. Michael sank onto a bale of hay, rubbing his face with trembling hands. "You've got a fight ahead of you, friend," he said, glancing at the horse. "But I'll see you through it. I promise." The horse didn't respond, its eyes fluttering closed in exhaustion. Michael stayed there, watching over it as the storm finally began to fade. Morning brought no peace. Michael was barely awake when the first knock came. A small crowd had gathered outside the barn, their faces curious and skeptical. "Michael, what's this nonsense?" a man called out. "You taking in strays now?" Others chimed in, their voices sharp and mocking. "That thing's half dead. You'll only waste your time." Michael stepped outside, his face calm but firm. "I couldn't just leave it there," he said. "It needs help." "Help?" an older woman scoffed. "It's a mercy to put it down." Michael's jaw tightened. "Maybe to you, but not to me," the crowd murmured, some shaking their heads as they dispersed. A few lingered, their disapproval evident. Michael ignored them, turning back to the barn. Inside, the horse opened its eyes slightly, its gaze meeting his. For the first time, there was a faint flicker of something else. Trust, maybe, or hope. Michael knelt beside it, brushing a hand along its neck. "They don't see what I see," he said quietly. "But don't you worry, we'll prove them wrong." Michael stood at the stall door, his eyes fixed on the horse lying motionless in the corner. It hadn't moved since he'd brought it in. The damp straw clung to its frail body, and its breaths were shallow, each one rattling in its chest like a struggle against giving up. "Come on," Michael muttered under his breath. "Don't quit on me now." He stepped inside, bucket of water in hand, and crouched beside the animal. The smell of blood and infection hit him harder today. The leg was still swollen, red, and angry, but it was the horse's hollow stare that weighed heavier. It wasn't just pain, it was something worse. Michael dipped a rag into the water and started cleaning one of the cuts on its flank. As the rag touched its skin, the horse twitched violently, letting out a sharp whinny and jerking its head toward him. "Easy, easy," Michael said, pulling his hand back. He kept his voice calm, steady, but his heart was racing. Every movement it made seemed to sap what little strength it had left. "I'm not here to hurt you." The horse's eyes darted around the stall, its body trembling as though expecting another blow. Michael clenched his jaw. He'd seen animals like this before, ones that had been kicked, beaten, left to fend for themselves. They never trusted anyone, not easily. "You've been through it, haven't you?" he said softly. "But that's done now. You're here, and no one's going to lay a hand on you again." It didn't calm down, not right away, but it didn't try to move either. Michael took that as a small win and pressed the rag against the wound again, this time slower, gentler. The horse flinched but stayed still. He worked quietly, cleaning the cuts, rubbing salve over the raw spots where the skin had split. The gash near its leg was the worst of it, a jagged tear that must have happened weeks ago, left untreated. He wrapped it carefully with strips of clean cloth, tying the ends tight, but not so tight it would cut off circulation. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on his jeans. The horse's breathing was still labored, but it seemed calmer now, its head resting on the straw. Michael felt a flicker of relief but knew it was too early to relax. The bucket of water sat untouched. The hay he left the night before hadn't been touched either. He picked up a handful and held it close to the horse's mouth. "Come on, you need to eat something," he said. The horse didn't move. Michael sighed and dropped the hay back into the pile. His hands tightened into fists, frustration bubbling in his chest. It wasn't frustration at the horse, it was at himself, at how helpless he felt. "You're not making this easy, you know that," he muttered, standing and pacing the stall. His boots crunched against the straw. He turned back to the horse, its frail body still lying limp. "But I guess you don't have to. I'm not giving up." He stepped out of the stall and grabbed a small jar from the workbench nearby. Inside was a mixture he'd learned to make years ago, a blend of herbs meant to soothe and heal. He poured a bit into a bottle, added water, and shook it until it mixed. Back inside the stall, Michael knelt again and gently slid the bottle's spout into the horse's mouth. "Just a little," he said, tilting it slowly. Some of the liquid dribbled out, but he managed to get a few sips into the horse before it pulled its head away. "That's better than nothing," he said, setting the bottle down. The horse's ear flicked slightly. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign of acknowledgement it had given him. Michael allowed himself a small, grim smile. The days that followed were no easier. Every morning, Michael would come in with fresh water and hay, cleaning the wounds and rewrapping the leg. Every time he raised his hand, even just to adjust the bandages, the horse would flinch, its muscles tensing as though bracing for pain. Michael kept his movements slow, his voice low. "It's all right," he'd say each time. "I'm not going to hurt you." By the third day, he started to notice small changes. The horse's breathing wasn't as ragged. It twitched less when he worked on its wounds. One afternoon, as Michael was cleaning the stall, he glanced over and saw it chewing on the hay for the first time. "There you go," he said, a hint of relief in his tone. "That's what I've been waiting for." It wasn't much, just a few bites before it stopped again, but it was enough to keep him going. One evening, as he was sitting by the stall, Michael noticed the horse watching him. Its eyes were still guarded, but there was something else there now. Curiosity, maybe. He held its gaze for a long moment, then reached out a hand. The horse didn't pull away. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Slowly, he reached up and brushed his fingers along its neck. The horse stiffened at first, but didn't move. "That's it," Michael said quietly, one step at a time. The connection was small, fragile, but it was there, and for the first time since that stormy night, Michael felt hope. For 2 weeks they had followed this pattern. Every morning Michael would bring food and water, tend to the wounds, and then sit with the horse, talking softly about nothing in particular. At first it had barely acknowledged him, its body tense, its eyes darting to every movement as though expecting a blow. But each day the tension lessened. Each day it seemed to trust him a little more. "You're looking better," Michael said, his voice calm and steady. He leaned back against the stall wall, letting his weight settle. "Still skinny as a rail, but I'd say you've got a bit more fire in you. Not that you'd admit it." The horse's ears flicked again, and this time it turned its head slightly toward him. Michael's chest tightened at the sight. That was the first time it had looked at him directly without fear. "Well, I'll be," he said softly. "You really are coming around, huh?" It wasn't much. A small shift in posture, a faint light in those once blank eyes. But it was enough to fill Michael with a quiet sense of victory. He let the moment linger before getting to work, his movements careful and deliberate. He cleaned the leg wound first, unwrapping the old bandages and applying fresh ones. The horse stiffened but didn't pull away. When he reached for the salve to apply to a cut along its shoulder, it stood perfectly still. "You're a tough one," Michael muttered, tying off the last bandage. "Guess that makes 2 of us." The turning point came later that afternoon. Michael had just finished his chores and decided to sit with the horse for a while. He brought a small stool into the stall and lowered himself onto it, leaning his elbows on his knees. The horse was calmer now, its body no longer trembling with each shift of weight. Michael sat in silence, letting the quiet settle between them. Then, without warning, the horse stepped forward, a single tentative step. It paused, its ears flicking nervously, then took another. Before Michael could react, it closed the gap between them, lowering its head and pressing it gently against his shoulder. For a moment, Michael froze, his breath catching in his chest. The warmth of the horse's head against him was startling, almost surreal. Slowly, he raised a hand, resting it lightly on the animal's neck. Its coat was rough and uneven, but beneath it he could feel the steady rhythm of life, a heartbeat, strong and resilient. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. "Look at you, brave as can be." The horse stayed there for what felt like minutes, its body relaxed, its breathing calm. When it finally pulled away, Michael smiled. a small, quiet smile that reached his tired eyes. He had seen his share of struggles in life, but this moment felt like a victory unlike any other. From that day on, the horse's demeanor changed. It no longer shied away when Michael entered the stall. It began to nuzzle him gently when he brought food, and it even allowed him to stroke its mane without flinching. The walls of fear and distrust it had built around itself were slowly crumbling, replaced by something fragile but real. The change didn't go unnoticed by the neighbors. One morning, as Michael was brushing the horse's coat, the familiar voice of Carmen called out from the barn door. "Michael, is that the same sorry critter you pulled in from the storm? I hardly recognize it." Michael turned, wiping his hands on his pants. "It's the same one," he said, his tone laced with quiet pride. "Just needed some time is all." Carmen stepped closer, carrying a bundle of fresh hay. "Well, you've done a fine job. I didn't think it'd make it, but you've proved me wrong." Michael nodded, taking the hay from her. "Thanks, Carmen. Appreciate it." Word spread quickly through the village, and soon others began stopping by to see the horse that had defied the odds. Lucas, a wide-eyed boy from down the road, became a frequent visitor, always eager to help. He would sweep out the stall, refill the water trough, and ask endless questions about how to care for an animal. "It's not just about food and water, Lucas," Michael told him one afternoon. "You've got to show them you care. Animals aren't so different from people. They know when someone's got their best interests at heart." Lucas nodded solemnly, as though committing every word to memory. "I'll remember that." Later that night, as the barn grew quiet, Michael sat by the stall, his head resting against the wooden wall. The horse stood nearby, its body relaxed, its eyes calm. For the first time in years, Michael felt a sense of connection he hadn't realized he was missing. "You're not the only one learning to trust again," he said softly. "Guess we're both a work in progress." The horse let out a low snort, and Michael chuckled. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Michael tightened the last knot on the hay bundle strapped to the wagon, his weathered hands moving with practiced ease. The horse shifted its weight, the creak of the harness straps cutting through the quiet morning air. Its coat, once dull and matted, now shone with a healthy sheen. The wounds that had marred its body were mostly healed, leaving behind faint scars that told a story of survival. "All right, buddy," Michael murmured, his voice low and steady. "Let's get this load to Carmen before the sun decides to make us work harder." It was remarkable how far the horse had come. Once barely able to stand, it now walked with a confident stride, its muscles stronger with each passing day. For weeks, Michael had tended to it with unwavering patience, watching as its injuries slowly mended and its spirit returned. Now the horse had grown into more than just a companion. It had become a partner, eager to share in the work that filled Michael's days. Michael began to trust the horse with small tasks around the village, using it to haul water barrels, transport bundles of firewood, and carry supplies for neighbors. Each time the horse met the challenge with quiet determination, as if it understood that its new purpose was helping others. The journey through the village that morning was like so many others recently, a quiet, steady rhythm of hooves against gravel, punctuated by the occasional greeting from passers-by. Carmen was waiting at her gate, her apron dusted with flour as she waved them down. "Michael, you're a godsend, truly," she said, bustling forward to help him unload the hay. Her eyes flicked to the horse, and her expression softened. "And look at this one, strong as an ox and twice as determined." Michael smiled faintly, resting a hand on the horse's neck. "He's got a lot of fight in him, just needed someone to remind him it was still there." The villagers noticed the horse's transformation, and little by little they started to see Michael differently too. He wasn't just the solitary man who kept to himself anymore. He was someone willing to help, someone who had found strength and purpose in caring for a creature that once seemed beyond saving. It was during one of these errands that Michael met Antonio. The man's name had been spoken with reverence among the older villagers, a retired horse trainer who had once coached champions, but now lived a quiet life on the outskirts. Michael had been delivering a load of firewood to Antonio's home when the older man stepped out of his porch and eyed the horse with an intensity that caught Michael off guard. "That's a fine animal you've got there," Antonio said, his voice a mix of gravel and honey. He approached slowly, his gait deliberate, as if respecting the horse's space. Michael tipped his hat. He wasn't much to look at when I found him. Took a lot to get him back on his feet. Antonio ran a hand along the horse's flank, his eyes narrowing in thought. Not just strength, he's got something else, Spirit. He looked up at Michael, a spark of curiosity in his gaze. Have you ever thought about entering him in the village race? Michael blinked, caught off guard. A race? He's been through enough already. I'm just trying to give him a good life. Antonio chuckled, stepping back to meet Michael's eye. That's exactly why he'd be perfect. Races aren't just about speed or strength. They're about heart, about showing the world what's possible when you refuse to give up. I've seen horses like him before. Broken, beaten, but not defeated. Michael frowned, running a hand over his jaw. I don't know. It's one thing to help him heal, but to put him through something like that feels like asking too much. Antonio's expression softened. I once trained a horse not so different from yours. A rescue, abandoned and half dead. But that horse taught me something about resilience. It wasn't about winning. It was about proving we all have more inside us than we think. The words stayed with Michael long after he left Antonio's home. That evening, as he stood by the stall brushing the horse's mane, he found himself speaking aloud. What do you think, boy? Could we do it? Not to win, just to show him what you've got. The horse turned its head, ears pricking forward. Then it did something Michael didn't expect. It nuzzled his shoulder, letting out a soft whinny. Michael laughed, the sound rough but genuine. Well, I'll take that as a yes. The next morning, training began. At first, they kept it simple, walking the trails near the farm, practicing turns and stops. Michael worked slowly, never pushing too hard. He could feel the horse's trust growing with each passing day, its movements becoming more confident, its reactions sharper. Antonio would drop by occasionally, his presence unassuming, but his advice invaluable. Loosen your grip on the reins, Michael. Let him find his rhythm, he'd say, his voice calm but firm. Or don't forget to talk to him. Your voice is just as important as your hands. Michael took the lessons to heart, and soon they were galloping across open fields, the wind whipping through Michael's hair and the horse's mane flying like a banner of triumph. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling session, Michael tripped over a rock and fell hard onto the ground. The horse stopped instantly, turning back and lowering its head to nudge him gently. Michael sat up, rubbing his sore arm. You're really something, you know that? He said, his voice thick with emotion. The horse snorted, stamping its hoof as if to say, let's keep going. Word of their training spread through the village like wildfire. Children would gather along the fences to watch, their laughter and cheers filling the air. Carmen began bringing extra oats and carrots for the horse, calling it the village's champion in the making. Even the once skeptical neighbors started to show up, their curiosity turning to admiration. You're making us proud, Michael, one man said, clapping him on the back after a practice run. Michael nodded, a faint smile on his lips. Just doing what feels right. As the day of the race drew closer, the bond between Michael and the horse grew unshakable. They weren't just man and animal anymore. They were partners, two souls united by resilience and trust. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael leaned against the stall door, watching the horse as it rested. We're ready, he said softly. Not for them, for us. The horse lifted its head, its gaze steady and full of the quiet strength that had carried them this far. Michael smiled, a deep warmth settling in his chest. The months of preparation had been grueling, yet transformative. From the moment Antonio had first suggested the race, Michael and the horse had worked tirelessly, turning each day into a step toward the impossible. As the months turned into weeks, then days, the weight of the approaching race settled on all of them. Even Antonio, with his seasoned experience, began to show signs of nerves. Do you really think we're ready? Antonio had asked one evening, the worry etched on his face. Michael had nodded, his voice calm but firm. We're ready. The horse is strong, and we've done all we can. Now it's about trust. And then finally the day had arrived. Antonio was up before dawn, pacing nervously near the stables, while Michael saddled the horse with practiced ease. The animal stood still, calm as ever, as though sensing the significance of the day. "We've trained for this," Michael said quietly, his hands steady as he tightened the straps. "We just have to stick to the plan." Antonio looked unconvinced, his hands fidgeting with the brim of his hat. "Plans don't mean much when you're up against horses bred for speed, Michael. They've been doing this their whole lives." Michael paused, meeting Antonio's eyes. "Neither of us has ever been about doing what's expected. Let them underestimate us. We've got something they don't." "And what's that?" Antonio asked, his voice low. Michael smiled faintly, patting the horse's neck. "Heart." The horse nudged Antonio gently, its warm breath brushing his arm. It was as if it was reminding him that they were a team now, a team built on faith, perseverance, and unspoken understanding. With the preparations complete, they made their way toward the village square, where the race would soon begin. The air crackled with anticipation as Michael and Antonio approached the gathering crowd. The atmosphere buzzed with energy as the village square transformed into a vibrant festival ground. Flags flapped in the wind, and the crowd gathered around the makeshift racetrack, their excitement echoing in cheers and laughter. Michael and his horse entered the field quietly, their calm presence a stark contrast to the more flamboyant competitors. The other riders perched confidently on their strong, gleaming horses, glanced at Michael with raised eyebrows or exchanged smug grins. "That old man and his skinny horse? They're here for the wrong reasons," someone muttered from the crowd, drawing a ripple of laughter. Michael remained unbothered. He had faced ridicule before, and today wasn't about proving anything to the skeptics. He gave the horse a firm pat on its neck, his voice low and steady. "Easy now. Let's just do what we've trained for." Antonio stood by the sidelines, gripping the wooden fence so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You sure about this, Michael?" he called out, his voice barely masking his nerves. Michael turned, his face composed but kind. "We've got this, Antonio. Trust the training and trust her." The horse flicked its ears, almost as if to echo his confidence. Antonio exhaled slowly, nodding, though his worried eyes lingered on them as they took their place at the starting line. The starter's whistle cut through the noise, and the racers surged forward. Dust kicked up in a frenzy as hooves thundered against the dry ground. Michael and the horse, however, held back, taking slow, deliberate strides. From the stands, laughter erupted. "They're falling behind already," a boy called out. Michael ignored the taunts, focused solely on the horse beneath him. He leaned slightly forward, his voice calm as he urged, "Steady now. Remember, we're playing the long game." Around them, the other racers pushed hard, their horses straining against the breakneck pace. But as the first leg of the race stretched on, cracks began to show. The fastest riders faltered slightly, their horses panting from the relentless sprint. Michael smirked slightly, glancing ahead. "Now, let's show them what we can do." Michael shifted in his saddle, giving a gentle nudge to the horse's flank. The animal responded immediately, muscles coiling with renewed energy as it quickened its pace. They began to weave through the pack, one rider at a time. The crowd's murmur turned into excited whispers. "Look, they're catching up." Antonio, who had been pacing in worry, paused mid-step, his mouth slightly agape. "Come on, Michael," he muttered under his breath, his fingers clasped in silent prayer. The horse moved with grace and determination, finding openings where others stumbled. Michael kept his focus forward, his voice steady and encouraging. By the middle of the race, they were near the front. The cheers of the crowd swelled, no longer mocking but admiring. "Where did that come from?" a rider hissed as Michael and his horse overtook him. Michael didn't reply, his attention solely on the final stretch looming ahead. The finish line came into view, a blur of cheering faces and waving flags. At the forefront was a young rider on a sleek black horse, its every muscle rippling with speed. The boy looked over his shoulder, spotting Michael closing in. "You're not taking this from me," the boy shouted, urging his horse faster. Michael gritted his teeth. "We're close," he murmured to his horse. "Let's finish strong." The two teams were neck and neck, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. The crowd leaned forward, their voices rising to a fever pitch. Then disaster struck. The black horse stumbled, its hoof catching on a loose stone. The young rider let out a cry as both he and his horse crashed to the ground in a cloud of dust. Gasps rippled through the audience. Michael's horse surged ahead, but he pulled back on the reins, bringing the animal to an abrupt halt just short of the fallen duo. Michael leaped from the saddle, rushing to the young man's side. The boy groaned, clutching his arm, his face pale with pain. "Easy, son. Let me help," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "You could have won," the boy rasped, his eyes wide with disbelief. Michael shook his head, glancing at the injured horse now struggling to rise. Winning doesn't mean leaving someone behind. With practiced care, Michael checked the black horse's leg. It was shaken but not seriously hurt. He gave a nod of reassurance to the boy. "She's fine, just scared. Like you." Michael stood, extending a hand. "Come on, we'll cross that finish line together." The boy hesitated before taking Michael's hand, letting him pull him up. With some effort, they got the young rider onto Michael's horse, while Michael led the black horse by its reins. The sight of Michael, the boy, and the two horses approaching the finish line drew a stunned silence from the crowd. The announcer's voice broke the spell. "They're coming in together. What an act of sportsmanship." As the small group crossed the line, the silence gave way to thunderous applause. Antonio, wiping tears from his face, shouted above the din, "That's my friend out there." Michael handed the reins to a stable hand and helped the boy dismount. The young rider turned to him, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I'll never forget this." Michael smiled faintly, patting the boy's shoulder. "Take care of that horse of yours. She's got a lot of heart." Michael watched the boy lead his horse away, a lingering smile on his face. The sun was dipping lower now, casting long shadows across the village square. Around him, the crowd buzzed with excitement, their voices full of admiration and wonder. Yet Michael stood quietly, his hand resting on the neck of his horse, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breath. "You've done something special today," Antonio said as he approached, his voice thick with emotion. He clapped Michael on the shoulder, but his gaze went to the horse. "Both of you." Michael nodded, his voice low and even. "She's got the heart of a champion, Antonio. Always has. I just helped her remember it." The moment swelled with the noise of villagers crowding closer, eager to offer their congratulations. Carmen's voice rang out above the din. "Michael, I knew you could do it." She wiped at her eyes with a handkerchief, then stepped forward, pressing something into his hand. It was a small medallion, old and worn, with an engraving of a horse etched into its surface. "This belonged to my husband," she explained, her voice trembling. "He loved horses as much as you do. I think he'd want you to have it." Michael swallowed hard, his weathered hands closing gently around the token. "Thank you, Carmen," he said, his voice soft but steady. "It means a lot." As the evening wore on, the village square became a celebration ground. Tables laden with food appeared seemingly out of nowhere, and lanterns were strung between trees, their soft glow illuminating the joyous faces of the villagers. Michael found himself at the center of it all, though it was a place he had never sought. People who once avoided him now approached with smiles, their words filled with gratitude and respect. "You showed us what it means to care, Michael," one man said, shaking his hand. "You made us proud," said another. Lucas, the young boy who often visited Michael, darted between the crowd to stand by his side. His wide eyes were fixed on the horse, his hands reaching up to stroke its mane. "She's the best horse in the world," he declared with a grin. Michael chuckled, tousling the boy's hair. "She's one of a kind, that's for sure." As the night deepened, Michael finally found a quiet corner near the stable. The horse stood beside him, munching on a bundle of fresh hay someone had brought over. He leaned against the fence, his thoughts drifting. It wasn't the victory that filled his chest with warmth. It was everything that had come before it. The nights spent tending to wounds, the hours of patience as trust was built, and the way the horse had looked at him today as if to say, "We can do this together." "Thank you," Michael murmured, his voice low. He ran a hand down the horse's neck, feeling the smoothness of its coat. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible." The horse lifted its head, its eyes meeting his in the dim light. For a moment there was silence, and in that quiet connection, Michael felt the weight of all they had overcome together. The days following the race brought changes that rippled through the village. Where once Michael had been a solitary figure, now his small farm became a place of gathering. Villagers stopped by with gifts, sacks of grain, handmade blankets, even flowers. "Thought your girl might like these," one woman said, setting a bunch of carrots on the fence post. Lucas came nearly every day, full of questions about horses and their care. He followed Michael around the farm, soaking up every word. "How do you know what she needs, Michael?" the boy asked one afternoon. "You listen," Michael replied simply, "not just with your ears, but with your heart." The boy frowned thoughtfully, then nodded as if he understood. One morning, Carmen arrived with a group of villagers carrying a large wooden crate. "We've got something for you," she said, her smile mischievous. Michael raised an eyebrow, but stepped aside as they began to unpack the box. Inside was a beautifully carved statue of a horse, its form captured mid-gallop. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail etched with care. "It's for you," Carmen said, "to remind us all of what you and your horse have done." Michael stared at the statue, his throat tight. "I don't know what to say," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Say you'll keep inspiring us," Carmen replied with a wink. The statue was placed in the village square, where it stood as a testament to perseverance, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his horse. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. The horse, fully recovered, moved with a strength and grace that spoke of its newfound confidence. One evening, as the sun set in hues of gold and orange, Michael stood at the edge of his field. The horse grazed nearby, its movements slow and content. Michael crossed his arms, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We've come a long way," he said aloud, though the words were more for himself than anyone else. The horse looked up briefly, as if acknowledging him, then returned to its grazing. Michael's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sun dipped lower with each passing moment. In the stillness, he felt a profound sense of peace. Life, he realized, wasn't about the victories or the accolades. It was about the journey, every step, every struggle, every connection that made the road worth traveling. In the months since the race, life had changed in ways Michael never imagined. The small farm that once felt so lonely was now full of life. Villagers stopped by often, not just for help, but for companionship. The horse, once a symbol of tragedy and survival, had become something greater, a beacon of hope. Each day, Michael and the horse continued to work together, helping wherever they were needed. Whether it was pulling a cart of firewood for an elderly neighbor or delivering sacks of grain to the mill, the horse moved with a strength and calmness that inspired everyone. "Look at her," Antonio would often say, his voice tinged with pride. "She's more than just strong, she's got heart." Antonio had become a frequent visitor, his presence a comforting constant. Though retired, his passion for horses seemed to have found new life in watching Michael and the horse. "You've done something special here, Michael," Antonio said one afternoon, as they leaned against the fence watching the horse graze. "Not many people could have turned a broken animal into something so remarkable." Michael shook his head, his gaze soft. "She healed herself, Antonio. I just gave her the space to do it." But Antonio wasn't convinced. "You did more than that. You gave her trust, and in return, she gave it back." Lucas, the young boy who had been captivated by the horse from the start, became a regular at the farm. He followed Michael around like a shadow, asking endless questions and soaking in every bit of knowledge. "Why does she listen to you so well?" Lucas asked one day as Michael worked on fixing a loose horseshoe. Michael smiled, wiping his hands on a rag. "Because I listened to her first." "You've got to pay attention, Lucas. Horses, they tell you what they need. You just have to be patient enough to hear it." Lucas nodded thoughtfully, his small hands resting on the fence. "I want to be like you, Michael. I want to take care of animals and help them." Michael's heart swelled at the boy's earnestness. "You can do it, Lucas. Just remember it takes time and care. But if you do it right, it's worth every minute." Antonio, overhearing the conversation, chuckled. "Looks like you're passing on your secrets, old man." Michael laughed softly. "Not secrets, Antonio. Just lessons learned the hard way." One crisp autumn morning, The villagers gathered in the square for a ceremony Michael hadn't expected. A simple wooden plaque had been placed near the statue of the horse, with words etched into its surface, in honor of Michael and his horse, who showed us the strength of kindness and the power of hope. Michael stood quietly as the plaque was unveiled, his hands resting on the horse's bridle. The villagers clapped and cheered, but what moved him most was the quiet respect in their eyes. These were the same people who had once doubted him, who had mocked his efforts. Now they looked at him with gratitude and admiration. As the crowd began to disperse, Antonio leaned close, his voice low but warm. "You've done more than heal a horse, Michael. You've healed this village. Don't ever forget that." Michael didn't reply, but his eyes glistened as he gave Antonio a grateful nod. That night, under a sky bursting with stars, Michael sat on a wooden stool near the barn. The horse stood close, its head lowered as it rested after a long day. Michael reached out, running a hand down its neck, feeling the warmth of its presence. "You've changed my life, girl," he murmured, in ways I never saw coming. The horse shifted, pressing its muzzle against his shoulder, as if to say the feeling was mutual. From the house, Lucas's laughter echoed faintly. The boy had stayed late again, helping Michael clean out the stalls. He was already proving to have a knack for understanding animals, and Michael couldn't help but feel a quiet pride watching him grow. Antonio's words came back to him then. "You've healed this village." Michael had never set out to change anything beyond his small world, but somehow the ripples of his choices had spread far and wide. As the night deepened, Michael leaned back, his gaze lifting to the stars. Life had been hard, losses, heartbreaks, and struggles he'd thought might never end. But sitting there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the farm and the steady presence of the horse, he realized how far he'd come. "Life isn't about where you start," he said softly, his words carried away by the gentle night breeze. "It's about what you make of it." The horse let out a soft nicker, as if in agreement, and Michael chuckled, his chest warm with gratitude. Somewhere out there, Lucas was dreaming of horses, Antonio was probably sitting by his fire thinking of his own racing days, and the villagers were tucked into their beds, feeling a little more connected than before. Michael closed his eyes, the weight of the day lifting as sleep began to take hold. And as the stars shone above, he knew that tomorrow would bring more work, more lessons, and more quiet moments like this, moments that made everything worthwhile. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss another inspiring video. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you meaningful and profound stories about perseverance, love, and life transformation. Share this story with your friends and family to spread the positive message. Make sure to turn on notifications so you stay updated with our latest uploads. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.